Picture this. It is September 9th, 9 AD, and you are a Roman legionary marching through the Teutoburg Forest in Germania. You have served in 3 campaigns. You have marched across deserts and mountains. You have conquered cities that kings said were unconquerable. You wear the armor of the greatest military machine the world has ever seen. Your legion has never lost a battle, never. And yet, as you look up at the dense canopy of oak and beech trees closing in above you, as the fog rolls through the undergrowth like something alive, you feel something you have never felt before in all your years of service. You feel fear. The column stretches for miles, 3 entire legions, 17,000 of Rome's finest soldiers, plus 10,000 auxiliary troops and camp followers. You can barely see 50 yards ahead through the mist and the trees. The narrow track you are following is turning to mud under the weight of thousands of boots and hooves. Somewhere ahead, your commander, Publius Quinctilius Varus, rides in his ornate carriage, confident that the Germanic tribes are pacified, that this is just a routine march to winter quarters. He is wrong, catastrophically, fatally wrong, because hidden in the fog, watching your every step, are 40,000 warriors who have been waiting for this exact moment. Warriors led by a man who knows your tactics, speaks your language, and has studied your weaknesses for years. His name is Arminius, and he is not just a Germanic chieftain. He is a Roman citizen. He is a Roman officer. He was trained by Rome to kill for Rome, and now he is going to use everything Rome taught him to destroy Rome. Before diving into this catastrophic ambush that would haunt Rome for generations, if you enjoy learning about the moments that change history, consider hitting that like button and subscribing for more content like this. And please comment below to let me know where you are listening from. I find it incredible that we are exploring these ancient tragedies together from different parts of the world, connected across time and space by our shared fascination with the past. You need to understand what it meant to be a Roman legionary in 9 AD. You need to understand why the destruction of these 3 legions would send shockwaves across the entire empire. The Roman army was not just a military force. It was an idea. It was the physical manifestation of Roman superiority, Roman discipline, Roman destiny. For 400 years, the legions had been marching across the known world, crushing everything in their path. They had conquered Gaul. They had invaded Britain. They had pushed the borders of the empire from the Atlantic to the Euphrates. They had never met an enemy they could not eventually defeat through superior discipline, engineering, and sheer ruthless efficiency. A single legion was a terrifying thing. It consisted of roughly 5,000 heavily armed infantry, organized into 10 cohorts, divided into centuries of 80 men each. Every legionary was a professional soldier who had signed up for 25 years of service. He was not a conscript pulled from a farm. He was a trained killer who had spent months drilling formations, practicing sword work, and learning to move as one organism with his brothers. He could march 20 miles a day in full armor. He could build a fortified camp every single night, complete with walls, ditches, and watchtowers. He could construct bridges, siege engines, and roads. He was an engineer, a builder, and a warrior all in one package. The equipment of a legionary was designed for brutal efficiency. He wore a larica segmentata, a segmented plate armor that weighed about 20 pounds, but provided incredible protection against cuts and thrusts. Over his left shoulder hung a scutum, a massive curved rectangular shield made of laminated wood, covered in leather, and reinforced with metal. It weighed 22 pounds and could stop arrows, spears, and sword strikes. In his right hand, he carried a gladius, a short stabbing sword designed for close-quarters butchery. The blade was only 18 inches long, but it was perfectly weighted for the Roman fighting style. Thrust, withdraw, thrust again. The gladius was not made for slashing like a barbarian longsword. It was made for punching through ribs and organs in the tight press of formation combat. On his belt, he carried a pugio, a dagger for finishing wounded enemies. And before the enemy even reached sword range, he would hurl his pilum, a specialized javelin with a soft iron shank that would bend on impact, rendering enemy shields useless. The pilum was a work of engineering genius. When it struck a shield, the soft iron would bend, creating a dead weight that dragged the shield down and left the enemy exposed. If it struck flesh, it would penetrate deep and be nearly impossible to remove without causing further damage. A volley of pila from a cohort of 400 men could devastate an enemy formation before the legionaries even drew their swords. But the real weapon of the legion was not the sword or the shield. It was discipline. Roman soldiers fought in formation. They moved together, breathed together, killed together. They were trained to ignore fear, to march into a wall of spears without hesitation, to obey orders even when those orders meant certain death. This psychological conditioning made them nearly unstoppable in open battle. An army of brave individuals could not defeat an army of disciplined machines. History had proven this again and again. At Cannae, Hannibal had slaughtered 50,000 Romans, but that was through tactical genius, not individual valor. At Pharsalus, Caesar's veterans had routed Pompey's larger army because they held formation while their enemies panicked. At Alesia, the legions had crushed a Gallic relief force 5 times their size by maintaining discipline while surrounded. The legion was unbeatable when it fought on its own terms. By the year 9 AD, Rome had been pushing into Germania for nearly 30 years. The conquest had begun under Emperor Augustus, who dreamed of extending the empire's borders from the Rhine River to the Elbe River, effectively conquering all of the Germanic tribes and creating a natural frontier far to the east. The legions had won battle after battle. They had burned villages, executed chieftains, and forced submission. Roman forts had been built along the Weser River. Roman roads were being constructed to connect the new province to the rest of the empire. On paper, Germania was pacified. Roman governors administered justice. Roman merchants traded in the newly established settlements. Young Germanic nobles were being sent to Rome for education, learning Latin, learning Roman customs, learning Roman military tactics. It seemed like only a matter of time before Germania became just another province, thoroughly digested by the empire, transformed into a copy of Gaul or Spain. The Roman strategy for conquest was always the same. First, you defeated the enemy in battle. Second, you built roads and forts to control the territory. Third, you imposed Roman law and taxation to integrate the population into the empire. Fourth, you co-opted the local elite by offering them Roman citizenship and positions of authority. Finally, you waited for the old generation to die off and the new generation, raised speaking Latin and worshiping Roman gods, to forget that they had ever been anything other than Roman. It had worked in Gaul. It had worked in Spain. It had even worked in parts of Britain. Why would Germania be any different? This is where the Romans made their fatal mistake. They assumed that military victory meant cultural conquest. They assumed that because they had defeated the Germanic tribes in battle, those tribes had accepted Roman superiority. They did not understand that beneath the surface of cooperation, a volcano of rage was building. The Germanic people had not forgotten their freedom. They had not forgotten their gods, their traditions, their pride. They were biding their time, waiting for the perfect moment to strike back. And that moment was being carefully orchestrated by the most dangerous man in Germania, Arminius. To understand the magnitude of the betrayal, you have to understand who Arminius was. He was not some illiterate barbarian leading a peasant revolt. He was a product of Rome itself. Born around 18 BC into the Cherusci tribe, one of the most powerful Germanic peoples, Arminius was the son of Segamarus, a chieftain who had submitted to Roman authority. When Arminius was young, perhaps 10 or 12 years old, he was taken to Rome as a hostage, a common practice to ensure his father's loyalty. But Rome did not treat important hostages as prisoners. They treated them as investments. Young nobles from conquered territories were brought to Rome, educated, and transformed into loyal servants of the empire. It was cultural warfare, a way of breaking the spirit of resistance before it could take root in a new generation. Arminius was given a Roman education. He learned Latin fluently, not as a foreign language, but as a native speaker. He studied Roman history, from the foundation of the city by Romulus to the conquest of the Mediterranean by Scipio and Caesar. He learned Roman philosophy, the Stoic virtues of duty, honor, and self-control. He learned Roman law, the complex system of rights and obligations that held the empire together. And most importantly, he learned Roman military tactics. He studied the campaigns of Caesar in Gaul, Pompey in the east, and Augustus in Spain. He learned how the legions deployed, how they fortified camps, how they coordinated infantry and cavalry. He learned the Roman way of war from the inside. He was granted Roman citizenship, an incredible honor for a provincial, especially one from a recently conquered territory. Citizenship meant he was no longer a barbarian subject. He was a member of the Roman people, protected by Roman law, entitled to vote in Roman elections, eligible for Roman offices. He was even admitted into the equestrian order, the second tier of Roman nobility, just below the senatorial class. This was reserved for wealthy and influential men, and it came with a gold ring that marked the wearer as a member of the Roman elite. Arminius wore that ring. He wore the toga. He spoke Latin in the forum. To any observer, he was as Roman as Caesar himself. But Rome's generosity did not stop there. Arminius was commissioned as an officer in the Roman auxiliary forces, commanding Germanic cavalry units in the service of the empire. These auxiliary units were made up of non-citizens from conquered territories, serving alongside the legions in exchange for pay and the promise of citizenship after 25 years of service. Arminius proved himself a capable commander. He fought for Rome in campaigns along the Danube, battling other Germanic tribes and earning the respect of his Roman superiors. He was decorated for valor. He was promoted. He learned how the legions deployed, how they fortified camps, how they coordinated infantry and cavalry, and most crucially, how they could be beaten. For years, he observed the machine from the inside. He saw its strengths, the discipline, the engineering, the logistics that allowed Roman armies to operate hundreds of miles from their supply bases. But he also saw its weaknesses. He saw the arrogance of Roman commanders who viewed their Germanic auxiliaries as useful savages, good for scouting and skirmishing, but not worthy of respect. He saw how the legions struggled in terrain where they could not deploy their formations, how heavily armored infantry became vulnerable when they could not see their officers or maintain their ranks. He saw that Rome's greatest weapon, its discipline, became a liability when units were separated and isolated. He filed all of this information away, storing it like ammunition for a war he knew was coming. And while Arminius was learning all of this, while he was smiling and bowing and speaking perfect Latin, something was burning inside him. Rage. He had not forgotten that he was taken from his homeland as a child, ripped away from his family and his people to be raised by the conquerors. He had not forgotten the humiliation of his people, forced to bow to Roman governors, forced to pay Roman taxes, forced to watch as their forests were cut down to build Roman roads. He had not forgiven Rome for treating Germania as property to be divided and exploited, as if the land and the people who lived on it existed only to enrich Roman aristocrats. He was playing a long game, a game that required inhuman patience and perfect deception. He was going to use Rome's gifts against Rome itself. He was going to become Rome's most successful student, and then he was going to use everything he had learned to destroy his teachers. By the year 9 AD, Arminius had returned to Germania. He was no longer just an auxiliary commander. He had been elevated to the position of trusted advisor to Publius Quinctilius Varus, the governor of the province. This appointment was the culmination of years of careful maneuvering. Varus needed reliable local leaders who could help him administer the vast territory. Arminius, with his Roman citizenship, his military experience, and his fluent Latin, seemed like the perfect choice. He could translate Roman orders to the Germanic tribes. He could mediate disputes. He could command auxiliary troops who would not follow Roman officers. Varus trusted him completely. Publius Quinctilius Varus was a Roman aristocrat of the old school, wealthy, connected, and catastrophically incompetent in military matters. He had married into the imperial family, taking as his wife a granddaughter of Emperor Augustus. This connection had propelled him into positions of power far beyond his abilities. He had previously governed Syria, one of the richest provinces in the empire, where his brutal taxation policies and corrupt administration had sparked revolts. The Jewish historian Josephus later described Varus as a man who entered a rich province poor and left a poor province rich. He viewed his posting in Germania as a comfortable assignment, a chance to enrich himself before retirement, to extract as much wealth as possible from the conquered tribes before returning to Rome to enjoy his fortune. Varus treated Germania as if it were already a fully integrated Roman province. He set up his headquarters not in a frontier fort, but in a comfortable compound with all the luxuries of Roman civilization. He held court, hearing legal cases and rendering judgments according to Roman law, as if he were a magistrate in the forum rather than a governor in hostile territory. He imposed Roman taxes on the tribes, demanding grain, livestock, and precious metals. He ordered the construction of roads and bridges, conscripting Germanic laborers to do the work. He moved through the territory with a small bodyguard, confident in the submission of the tribes, never imagining that the smiling faces around him concealed murderous intentions. Varus trusted Arminius completely. After all, Arminius was a Roman citizen. He wore Roman clothes. He spoke Latin without an accent. He had fought beside Roman soldiers. He had bled for Rome. Why would he betray the empire that had given him everything? This is the moment where knowing history changes how you see the world. Varus was surrounded by warnings, but he could not see them. Other Roman officers, men with more experience in Germania, men who had spent years fighting in the forests and knew the Germanic character, tried to tell him that something was wrong. They reported that the tribes were restless, that young warriors were disappearing from the villages, that strange meetings were happening in the sacred groves deep in the forest. They noticed that Arminius was spending more and more time away from Roman oversight, traveling between tribes, speaking in hushed tones with other chieftains. One officer in particular, a man named Segestes, tried desperately to warn Varus. Segestes was Arminius's own father-in-law. He had given his daughter Thusnelda to Arminius in marriage, hoping to bind their families together and ensure loyalty to Rome. But Segestes had heard rumors. He had seen his son-in-law gathering warriors. He had intercepted messages suggesting a conspiracy. At a feast in the summer of 9 AD, just weeks before the disaster, Segestes approached Varus and begged him to arrest Arminius and the other Germanic nobles immediately. He told Varus that Arminius was planning a revolt, that the submission of the tribes was a facade, that the moment Varus led his legions away from their fortified camps, they would be attacked. He urged Varus to strike first, to round up the suspicious chieftains and execute them before the conspiracy could mature. Varus laughed at him. He dismissed the warnings as tribal jealousy, the paranoid ravings of an old man afraid of losing influence to his ambitious son-in-law. He could not conceive that Arminius, the civilized, Latinized, reliable Arminius, would bite the hand that had fed him. It was a failure of imagination that would cost 17,000 men their lives. Varus was so confident in Roman superiority that he could not imagine a world where a barbarian, even an educated one, would choose his primitive tribe over the glory of Rome. He believed that Roman civilization was so obviously superior that anyone exposed to it would naturally want to be part of it. He thought Arminius had been tamed, domesticated, transformed into a loyal servant. He was wrong. In the autumn of 9 AD, Varus led 3 legions into the interior of Germania. These were not just any legions. These were the 17th, 18th, and 19th legions, battle-tested units with proud histories. The 17th had fought in the Alpine campaigns. The 18th had served in Pannonia. The 19th had been part of the force that had first crossed the Rhine decades earlier. They were accompanied by 6 cohorts of auxiliary infantry, 3 squadrons of auxiliary cavalry, and a massive baggage train. When you added the camp followers, merchants, slaves, and families that traveled with the Roman army on the march, the total number of people in the column reached 27,000. This was not a punitive expedition. This was not a military campaign. Varus was simply marching his legions from their summer camp on the Weser River back to their winter quarters on the Rhine. It was supposed to be routine, a peaceful administrative movement through pacified territory. But then Arminius brought Varus a report. A distant tribe, the Angrivarii, had risen in revolt, attacking a Roman supply depot and killing the garrison. The rebellion was small but needed to be dealt with quickly before it spread to other tribes. Arminius offered to guide Varus and his legions to the site of the uprising. It would require a detour through the Teutoburg Forest, a dense stretch of woods that would add a few days to the march. But Arminius assured Varus that the route was safe and that his own Germanic auxiliaries would scout ahead to ensure no surprises. The alternative was to ignore the rebellion, which would make Varus look weak and might encourage other tribes to revolt. Varus, concerned about his reputation and trusting Arminius completely, agreed. He ordered the legions to break camp and follow Arminius into the forest. The trap was set. The bait had been taken. And with every mile the Romans marched deeper into the woods, the door behind them was quietly closing. What Varus did not know was that there was no revolt. The attack on the supply depot had been staged by Arminius himself, a false flag operation designed to lure the legions away from the open ground near the Rhine and into the nightmare terrain of the Teutoburg Forest. While Varus was making his decision, Arminius was sending secret messengers to every Germanic tribe within 100 miles. The Cherusci, his own people, the Marsi, the Chatti, the Bructeri. He told them that the moment had come, that the legions were walking into his trap, that they needed to gather their warriors and converge on the forest. He promised them that Rome could be beaten, that the invincible legions could be destroyed, that Germania could be free. And the tribes, hungry for revenge after years of humiliation, answered his call. The Teutoburg Forest was not like the manicured woodlands of Italy or the rolling hills of Gaul. It was a primeval nightmare, a place where the trees grew so thick that sunlight barely reached the ground. The ancient oaks and beeches were massive, their trunks several yards wide, their branches forming a canopy so dense that it created permanent twilight beneath them. The undergrowth was a tangle of thorns, ferns, and fallen logs. The ground was uneven, broken by ravines, streams, and bogs that appeared without warning. For a Roman legion, designed to fight in the open plains of Italy or the organized landscapes of the Mediterranean, this was the worst possible terrain. The legions were built to fight in formation, shield to shield, moving as a single disciplined mass. In the forest, that was impossible. The path Arminius led the Romans down was not a road. It was barely a trail, a muddy track that wound between massive oaks, over streams swollen by autumn rains, and through bogs that sucked at the wheels of the supply wagons. In places, the soldiers had to cut through fallen trees or build makeshift bridges over marshy ground. The columns slowed to a crawl. For a Roman legion, accustomed to marching at a steady pace of 20 miles per day on paved roads, this was torture. They were covering 5 miles in a day, sometimes less. Visibility was reduced to yards. Officers could not see their men. Centurions could not maintain contact between sentries. The tight discipline that made the legions invincible was breaking down with every step deeper into the forest. Picture the chaos of the march. The column stretched for over 10 miles, a thin line of men and wagons winding through the trees. At the front, the advance guard of Germanic auxiliaries led by Arminius scouted the path, or so the Romans believed. In reality, Arminius was marking the route, noting the best places for ambush, identifying where the terrain would trap the Romans and prevent them from deploying. Behind the scouts came the vanguard of the First Legion, roughly 1,000 men, struggling to keep their footing on the slippery mud. Their centurions barked orders, trying to maintain some semblance of formation, but it was like herding cats in the dark. Then came the baggage train, hundreds of wagons loaded with tents, food, weapons, and the accumulated plunder of a summer campaign. The wagons were pulled by oxen and mules that slipped and stumbled in the mud, their drivers cursing and whipping them forward. Mixed among the wagons were the non-combatants, the camp followers who accompanied every Roman army, wives and children of soldiers, merchants hoping to trade with the locals, slaves who served the officers, prostitutes who followed the legions from camp to camp, craftsmen who repaired equipment and made shoes. These people were not warriors. They were civilians, vulnerable and terrified. Behind the first baggage section came the Second Legion, then more wagons, then the Third Legion bringing up the rear. The rear guard was supposed to protect the column from attack, but in the forest, they could not see more than a few dozen yards behind them. The entire formation was a logistical nightmare, a city on the move, stretched impossibly thin and unable to defend itself. If the Romans had been marching through open country, this would have been acceptable. The legions could deploy rapidly if attacked, but in the forest, deployment was impossible. The column was a snake, and Arminius was about to chop it into pieces. On September 7th, 2 days into the march, the first attacks began. They came without warning, like lightning from a clear sky. Germanic warriors appeared from the trees, hurled javelins into the Roman column, and vanished before the legionaries could respond. A wagon driver would suddenly scream and fall with a spear in his back. His oxen, panicked by the smell of blood, would bolt, overturning the wagon and blocking the path. A soldier at the edge of the column would be grabbed by unseen hands and dragged into the undergrowth, his throat cut before he could call for help. His comrades would hear the struggle, turn to investigate, and find nothing but blood on the leaves. These were not mass assaults. They were pinpricks, carefully calculated to create fear and confusion. The Germans were not trying to destroy the legions yet. They were softening them up, like a butcher tenderizing meat before the slaughter. Every attack forced the Romans to stop, to investigate, to send patrols into the forest to find the attackers. But the patrols found nothing. The Germanic warriors knew every tree, every path, every hiding place. They could move through the forest silently, appearing and disappearing like ghosts. For the Romans, trapped on the narrow trail, unable to see their enemy, it was psychological torture. Varus ordered his men to keep marching. He assumed these were just opportunistic bandits, cowards who would run as soon as they faced organized resistance. He did not realize that every attack was coordinated, that Arminius was directing the Germanic forces like a conductor leading an orchestra of death. He did not know that while he sat in his covered carriage, protected by his bodyguard, Arminius was riding ahead, giving orders to the ambush parties, pointing out the weakest points in the Roman column, timing the attacks for maximum psychological impact. By nightfall on September 7th, the Romans had lost dozens of men, but they managed to build a fortified camp, as they had been trained to do. Even in enemy territory, even exhausted and terrified, the legionaries dug ditches, raised ramparts, and set watchtowers. They worked with the mechanical efficiency of men who had done this 1,000 times before. Within hours, they had constructed a defensive perimeter large enough to hold the entire army. Inside the walls, they were safe. The Germanic warriors could not assault a fortified Roman camp. They did not have siege equipment. They did not have the discipline to coordinate a mass assault. The earthen walls and sharpened stakes of the Roman camp were as effective as a stone fortress. But outside, in the darkness, the Romans could hear the sounds of the forest. Drums beating in the distance, war horns blowing, deep and mournful. Voices chanting in Germanic tongues, incomprehensible to the Roman soldiers, but clearly threatening. The psychological pressure was immense. The soldiers knew they were surrounded. They knew that the moment they left the camp, the attacks would resume. Some of the men were veterans who had fought in multiple campaigns. They had faced Gallic warriors, Germanic raiders, even Parthian cavalry. But this was different. This was not a battle. This was a hunt, and they were the prey. On the morning of September 8th, Varus gave the order to continue the march. Staying in the forest was not an option. They were running low on supplies. The wagons carried only enough food for a few more days. Their only hope was to reach open ground, to get back to the Rhine where reinforcements could reach them, where they could deploy properly and use their superior discipline to crush the Germanic warriors. But the moment the legions left the camp, the attacks intensified. The Germans no longer struck and ran. They pressed the column from all sides, targeting the wagons, killing the oxen, forcing the Romans to abandon their supplies. The Germanic warriors had spent days preparing the battlefield. They had built earthworks along the ridges overlooking the path, wooden ramparts reinforced with turf that gave them protected positions from which to hurl javelins and shoot arrows. They had felled trees across the trail, forcing the Romans to stop and clear the obstacles while under constant attack. They had dug pits and covered them with branches, traps that would break the legs of horses and men. Every advantage was on their side. They knew the terrain. They chose when to attack and when to withdraw. They could see the Romans struggling in the narrow passage below while remaining hidden themselves. The legions began to disintegrate. Units became separated by the terrain and the constant attacks. A cohort would stop to help clear a fallen tree, and by the time they finished, the rest of their legion was a mile ahead, out of sight. Some cohorts tried to form defensive squares, the classic Roman formation for fighting surrounded. But the undergrowth made coordination impossible. The Germanic warriors used the terrain like a weapon. They would appear on a ridge, hurl javelins down onto the Romans, then melt back into the trees before the legionaries could climb up to engage them. The Romans would struggle up the muddy slope, gasping for breath in their heavy armor, only to find their enemies gone and another volley of javelins coming from a different direction. It was not a battle. It was a sustained execution, a slow-motion massacre that went on for hours. The Germanic warriors were not trying to defeat the legions in open combat. They were bleeding them, exhausting them, breaking their spirit. Every hour more Romans died. Every hour more equipment was abandoned. The wagons carrying the tents were overturned and left behind. The wagons carrying the food were captured or destroyed. The soldiers began to throw away their heavy scutum shields to move faster. They discarded their armor to lighten their load. They were transforming from legionaries into refugees, from a disciplined army into a desperate mob. The camp followers suffered the worst. The Germanic warriors showed no mercy to the non-combatants. Women and children were cut down as they tried to flee into the forest. Merchants who offered gold and silver for their lives were killed and robbed. Slaves were slaughtered or captured to be sold. The screams of the dying echoed through the trees, a soundtrack of horror that demoralized the soldiers even as they tried to maintain discipline. Some legionaries broke ranks to try to save their families. They were immediately surrounded and killed. The officers shouted orders to hold formation, to ignore the screams, to keep marching. But how long can a man ignore the sound of his wife being murdered? By the afternoon of September 8th, the Roman column had become a trail of corpses and abandoned equipment. Varus tried to maintain order, riding up and down the column on his horse, shouting encouragement, promising his men that they would reach safety soon. But his authority was crumbling. Officers were shouting contradictory commands. Some cohorts were trying to push forward, others were trying to turn back. Still others were simply standing in place, too exhausted and terrified to move. Men were deserting their units to flee into the forest, only to be hunted down by Germanic scouts who knew the woods intimately. The few who tried to surrender were killed immediately. Arminius had given orders that no prisoners were to be taken, no mercy shown. This was extermination. That night, the remnants of the 3 legions built another fortified camp. but it was a shadow of the previous night's construction. They did not have enough men to defend the full perimeter. They did not have enough tools because so many had been lost. They did not have enough time because the Germanic attacks continued even as they worked, forcing them to fight and dig simultaneously. The ditches were shallow, the ramparts were low, the watchtowers were hastily constructed and unstable. The wounded lay in the mud, groaning for water that was not there. The medical staff had been killed or scattered. There were no bandages, no medicines, no hope. Varus held a council of war with his surviving senior officers. These were hard men, veterans of the dozens of campaigns, but even they were showing signs of despair. Some argued for abandoning the baggage and making a forced march through the night, trying to break through the Germanic lines and reach the Rhine before morning. It was a desperate plan, but at least it was action. Others suggested surrendering, hoping that Arminius would spare them if they offered terms, if they handed over their weapons and pleaded for mercy. Varus refused both options. He still believed that Roman discipline would see them through. He still believed that 3 legions, even bloodied and disorganized, could not be destroyed by barbarians. He was living in a delusion, clinging to the myth of Roman invincibility, even as that myth was being shattered around him. That delusion would die with him the next morning. September 9th, 9 AD, dawned with a cold rain that turned the forest floor into a swamp. The Romans broke camp and resumed the march, knowing it was likely their last day alive. They were no longer an army. They were a mob, stumbling forward through the mud, harassed at every step by an enemy they could barely see. The rain soaked through their clothes and made their armor even heavier. The mud sucked at their boots with every step. Men were collapsing from exhaustion, lying down in the mud and simply giving up. Their comrades could not stop to help them. To stop was to die. And then Arminius sprang the final trap. The path ahead narrowed into a bottleneck between a steep hill called the Calcries Berg and an impassable marsh called the Great Bog. The Romans had no choice but to funnel into this death corridor, a passage less than 100 yards wide. And waiting for them, hidden behind earthworks they had spent days constructing, were thousands of Germanic warriors. This was not a skirmish. This was the climax, the moment Arminius had been planning for years, the killing blow that would wipe 3 legions off the face of the earth. The Germans attacked from 3 sides simultaneously. From the hill, they rolled logs and boulders down onto the packed Roman column, crushing men and horses. The sound of the rocks crashing through the trees was like thunder. From the forest on the eastern side, they charged with spears and swords, a wave of screaming warriors crashing into the disorganized legionaries who could not form proper shield walls. From the rear, more warriors cut off any retreat, trapping the Romans in a killing box. The noise was apocalyptic, the clash of steel on steel, the screaming of wounded men, the war cries of the Germans shouting the names of their gods, the desperate orders shouted by Roman officers trying to rally their men. But there was no rallying. There was only dying. Picture what it was like to be a legionary in that moment. You have dropped your pack to lighten your load. Your scutum shield is gone, abandoned hours ago when your arm could no longer hold its weight. Your gladius is slick with blood, your own or the enemy's, you are not sure anymore. You are standing back to back with the men of your century, or what is left of them. Out of 80 men, maybe 20 are still alive. You see your centurion fall with an axe in his skull. You see the eagle standard of your legion, the sacred symbol that must never be captured, being dragged into the mud by a screaming Germanic warrior. You want to save it, but there are too many enemies. You cannot even save yourself. A spear slams into your side, punching through the gaps in your armor. The pain is incredible, like being stabbed with a bar of white-hot iron. You fall to your knees. You try to stand, but the mud holds you down. Your legs will not obey you. The rain is in your eyes. You see boots splashing through the mud around you, Roman boots and Germanic boots mixed together in the chaos. You hear Latin and Germanic voices shouting, but you cannot understand either anymore. The last thing you see before the darkness takes you is the face of a Germanic warrior, young, barely older than a boy, raising an axe above his head. His face is twisted with rage and triumph. You were invincible. You were Rome. And now, you are nothing. Publius Quinctilius Varus, the man who had led 3 legions to their deaths, did not die in the fighting. As the battle turned into a massacre, as his bodyguard was cut down around him, he realized that there was no escape. The man who had lived in luxury, who had enriched himself at the expense of the provinces, who had ignored every warning, finally understood what he had done. He drew his sword, the same sword he had worn as a symbol of his authority, and fell on it. It was the honorable Roman way, the dignified exit of a commander who had failed, but his death accomplished nothing. His body was found by the Germans, mutilated as a warning, and the head was cut off and sent to Arminius as a trophy. Some of the senior officers tried to negotiate surrender, hoping that their lives would be spared if they gave up their weapons. They shouted in Latin that they were Roman officers, men of rank, worth more alive as hostages than dead. The Germans accepted their surrender, disarmed them, and then executed them anyway. Some were crucified on the trees of the forest, their bodies left to rot as a message to Rome. Others were sacrificed to the Germanic gods in sacred groves, their throats cut on stone altars, while priests chanted prayers of thanksgiving for the victory. This was not a war of honor or chivalry. This was revenge, pure and absolute. The slaughter continued for hours. Small groups of legionaries tried to fight their way out, forming defensive circles and selling their lives dearly. Some managed to kill 10 or 20 Germans before being overwhelmed. A few hundred men, perhaps as many as 1,000, managed to break through the Germanic lines and flee toward the Rhine. They ran through the forest for days, hunted by Germanic scouts, collapsing from exhaustion and wounds. Most were caught and killed. A handful, maybe a few dozen, actually reached Roman territory, stumbling into frontier forts with tales of the disaster that no one wanted to believe. By the time the killing stopped, roughly 15,000 Roman soldiers were dead. The three legions, the 17th, 18th, and 19th, had ceased to exist. Their eagle standards, the most sacred symbols in the Roman military, were captured and displayed as trophies in Germanic sanctuaries. For Rome, this was not just a military defeat, it was a spiritual catastrophe. It was proof that the legions were not invincible. It was proof that barbarians, if they were clever and ruthless enough, could destroy the greatest army the world had ever known. When the news reached Rome, carried by the few survivors who had made it back to the Rhine, the city went into shock. Messengers rode day and night to bring the news to Emperor Augustus. When the emperor heard what had happened, he reportedly wandered the halls of his palace, banging his head against the walls, shouting, "Quinctilius Varus, give me back my legions!" He understood immediately that the disaster in the Teutoburg Forest had changed everything. The plan to conquer Germania was dead. The dream of extending the empire to the Elbe was finished. The Rhine, not the Elbe, would remain the frontier of the empire. Rome had been stopped. For the first time in living memory, Rome had been forced to retreat. The psychological impact was immense. Romans had grown up believing that their army was invincible, that the legions could conquer anyone, that Roman civilization would eventually spread to every corner of the world. The destruction of 3 entire legions shattered that belief. Augustus ordered that the numbers 17, 18, and 19 would never be used again for Roman legions. They were cursed, erased from history. New legions were raised with other numbers. The army that had seemed unstoppable had revealed itself to be mortal, but the story of the Teutoburg Forest did not end with the massacre. Rome demanded revenge. In the years following 9 AD, new legions were raised and marched into Germania under the command of Germanicus, one of Rome's finest generals and the adopted son of Emperor Tiberius. The Roman goal was clear: find the site of the massacre, recover the lost eagle standards, and punish the tribes who had dared to revolt. The campaigns of Germanicus were brutal and relentless. He burned villages. He executed prisoners. He took hostages. He was determined to make Germania pay for what it had done. In 15 AD, 6 years after the disaster, Germanicus and his legions finally reached the Teutoburg Forest. What they found there haunted them for the rest of their lives. The forest had not been cleaned up. The bones of the Roman soldiers lay scattered across miles of terrain, bleached white by the rain and sun. Skulls were nailed to trees as offerings to the Germanic gods. Armor and weapons lay rusted in the undergrowth. Altars had been built where the Germans had sacrificed captured Roman officers, and the bloodstains were still visible on the stones. The stench of death still hung in the air, even after 6 years. Germanicus ordered his men to bury the remains, to give the fallen legionaries the dignity of a proper Roman funeral. The soldiers wept as they gathered the bones of their brothers, knowing that it could have been them lying in the mud. They built funeral pyres and cremated thousands of bodies, speaking prayers to the gods and promising that the dead would be avenged. It was a moment of profound grief and rage, a moment when the horror of the defeat became real and personal. Germanicus fought several battles against the Germanic tribes, winning some, losing others. He managed to recover 2 of the 3 lost eagle standards, a symbolic victory that lifted Roman morale and proved that Rome had not given up on revenge. But he could not defeat Arminius. The Germanic chieftain, now a legend among his people, continued to evade capture, leading his warriors in a guerrilla war that drained Roman resources and morale. Arminius understood that he could not defeat Rome in open battle, but he could make the cost of conquering Germania so high that Rome would eventually give up, and that is exactly what happened. Eventually, Rome gave up. Emperor Tiberius, who succeeded Augustus, decided that the cost of conquering Germania was too high. The terrain was too difficult. The tribes were too stubborn. The resources required to maintain control over the territory could be better spent elsewhere. He ordered the legions to withdraw behind the Rhine and to fortify the frontier. Germania would remain free. Augustus's dream of a Germania Romana died in the mud of the Teutoburg Forest, and it would never be revived. As for Arminius, his fate was both tragic and fitting. He had united the Germanic tribes to defeat Rome, but unity did not last long after the victory. The tribes, always fractious and competitive, began to turn on each other. Old rivalries resurfaced. Different chieftains wanted to lead. Arminius tried to declare himself king of all the Germanic tribes, to create a centralized authority that could resist future Roman invasions and build a nation that could stand as an equal to Rome. But many of the chieftains saw him as a tyrant, a man who had become too powerful, too ambitious, too dangerous. They feared that he would become a Germanic version of a Roman emperor, ruling over them with absolute power. In 21 AD, 12 years after his greatest triumph, Arminius was assassinated. He was killed by members of his own family, relatives who feared his ambition and wanted to prevent him from becoming a king. He was only 37 years old. Rome did not kill him, his own people did. He had saved Germania from Roman conquest, but he could not save Germania from itself. He could not unite the tribes into a lasting nation. The Germanic peoples would remain divided for another 1,800 years, until the 19th century, when Germany finally unified into a single state. The Battle of the Teutoburg Forest became a foundational myth for both Rome and Germania. For Rome, it was a warning about the limits of empire, a reminder that not all peoples could be conquered, that arrogance and overconfidence could lead to catastrophic defeat. The Romans never forgot Varus's disaster. For generations, it was studied in military academies as an example of what happens when a commander ignores terrain, underestimates the enemy, and places trust in the wrong people. The loss of the 3 legions created a psychological barrier that Rome never truly overcame. The Rhine remained the frontier for the next 400 years, a permanent scar on the ambitions of the empire. For the Germanic peoples, the Battle of the Teutoburg Forest became a symbol of resistance against foreign domination. Arminius, whose Germanic name was likely Hermann, was transformed over the centuries into a national hero. In the 19th century, when German nationalists were trying to unify the fragmented German states into a single nation, they looked back to Hermann as the first German patriot, the man who proved that Germanic peoples could stand against the greatest empire the world had ever seen. In 1875, a massive monument was erected at Detmold, near the suspected site of the battle. The Hermannsdenkmal stands over 50 meters tall, depicting Hermann holding his sword high above his head, pointing west toward France, a defiant symbol of Germanic independence. The myth had outlived the man by nearly 2,000 years. Modern archaeology has helped us piece together what actually happened in the Teutoburg Forest. For centuries, historians debated the exact location of the battle. The ancient sources were vague, describing only a forest somewhere between the Weser and the Rhine. But in 1987, a British military officer named Tony Clun, who was stationed in Germany, took up metal detecting as a hobby. While searching in fields near the town of Calcries in Lower Saxony, he discovered Roman coins dating to the time of Augustus. Excited by the find, he contacted German archaeologists, who began systematic excavations of the site. What they found was extraordinary. The site at Calcries revealed a battlefield strewn with Roman artifacts, thousands of coins, weapons, pieces of armor, and human remains. The evidence showed that the Germans had constructed a massive earthwork barrier, a rampart built of turf and timber that stretched for hundreds of meters along a ridge. This barrier had channels the Roman column into a narrow passage where they could be attacked from above. Arrowheads, sling bullets, and broken swords testified to the ferocity of the fighting. Bones of pack animals and humans were found mixed together, confirming the chaos and slaughter of the final day. The site at Calcries is now considered the most likely location of the Teutoburg Forest disaster, though some historians continue to debate whether it was the main battlefield or just one of several ambush sites. What makes the Battle of the Teutoburg Forest so significant is that it represents a turning point in the history of Europe. If Varus had not led his legions into the forest, if Arminius had not betrayed Rome, Germania might have become a Roman province like Gaul or Britain. The Rhine would not have become a permanent frontier. Germanic culture might have been Romanized, absorbed into the empire the way so many other cultures were. The Germanic languages might have evolved into Romance languages like French or Spanish. Latin might have become the dominant language from the Atlantic to the Baltic. The entire ethnic and cultural map of Europe would have been redrawn. Instead, Germania remained free. The Germanic tribes maintained their independence, their languages, and their warrior culture. They remained outside the empire, a constant threat to the frontier, launching raids across the Rhine for centuries. And when the Roman Empire finally collapsed in the 5th century AD, it was Germanic tribes, Goths, Vandals, Franks, Saxons, who swept across the ruins and built the medieval kingdoms that would become modern Europe. The seeds of that future were planted in the Teutoburg Forest in 9 AD. The survival of Germanic independence meant that Europe would be divided between Latin and Germanic cultures, between Romance and Germanic languages, between Mediterranean and Northern traditions. That division still exists today. There is something profoundly human about this story, something that transcends the military tactics and the body counts. It is the story of a man, Arminius, who was torn between two worlds. He was raised by Rome, educated by Rome, honored by Rome. But he never stopped being Germanic. He carried the humiliation of his people like a wound that would not heal. He played the role of the loyal Roman officer so convincingly that he fooled everyone around him. But inside, he was planning the destruction of the empire that had claimed to civilize him. His betrayal was not spontaneous. It was calculated, patient, and utterly ruthless. He understood that to defeat Rome, he had to think like a Roman, to use Roman overconfidence and Roman arrogance as weapons against them. He became Rome's most successful student, and then he used everything he had learned to destroy his teachers. And then there is Varus, the tragic figure at the center of the disaster. He was not an evil man. He was not cruel by the standards of his time. He was simply a product of his culture, a Roman aristocrat who believed in Roman superiority so deeply that he could not imagine a world where Rome could lose. He trusted Arminius because it never occurred to him that a man who had benefited from Roman civilization would want to destroy it. He ignored the warnings because they contradicted his worldview, because accepting them would mean accepting that the entire Roman project was built on a lie. In the end, his blindness cost him everything: his army, his honor, and his life. His story is a warning about the dangers of cultural arrogance, about what happens when an empire becomes so confident in its invincibility that it stops listening to dissenting voices, that it assumes submission means acceptance. The 3 legions that marched into the Teutoburg Forest represented the height of Roman military power. They were the most advanced, most disciplined, most effective fighting force of the ancient world. But in the end, none of that mattered. They were destroyed not by a superior army, but by terrain, weather, deception, and the will of a people who refused to be conquered. The lesson of the Teutoburg Forest is brutal and timeless. Technology and training cannot overcome every obstacle. Sometimes, the will to resist, combined with knowledge of the ground and a willingness to fight without honor or mercy, is enough to shatter even the mightiest army. Sometimes, the underdog wins. And when the underdog is fighting for his homeland against an invader, when he is willing to sacrifice everything for freedom, even the legions of Rome can be stopped. If you have made it this far, you are clearly someone who values the deep, often brutal truths that emerge from studying military history. If this story of betrayal and annihilation resonated with you, please give this video a like. It truly helps these stories reach more people. And do not forget to subscribe and hit the bell icon so you do not miss our next deep dive into the battles that shaped Europe. I would love to hear your thoughts in the comments. Do you think Arminius was a freedom fighter or a traitor? Could Rome have ever successfully conquered Germania? Or was the Teutoburg Forest disaster inevitable? Let the debate begin below. Thank you for joining me in the forest where empires go to die.